few months ago, I decided to check out Aka Akasawa's Kaguya-sama Love is War. I went into the manga knowing only the basic premise and that it was over 250 chapters long. And all this made my manga alarm bells go off like crazy. I've read my share of shonen and seinen romcoms, and I have been burnt many times. Too many times to count. I knew that there was no way on earth that this series could be good. At best, it would be mildly entertaining. It might be enjoyable at the start, but inevitably it would be reduced to rehashing stale old rom-com cliches after 30 or so chapters. But as I kept reading, I was shocked to be proven completely and utterly wrong. The further I got into the story, the more I got sucked in not only by Kaguya-sama's humor, but also by its stunning character writing and its masterful plot construction. For me, Kaguya-sama has completely redefined what male demographic rom-coms could be at their best. And I hope to show you as well how Kaguya-sama could succeed where so many other have failed. Hello, my name is Sean, and I break down what makes great stories tick. So let's start with the manga's premise. Kaguya-sama opens with a bold declaration that flips the rom-com genre on its head. Love is not a wonderful experience, but a ruthless struggle for power. One with people who exploit and who are exploited. Winners and losers. Love is war. This manga revolves around two genius students who serve as the president and vice president of their school's student council, Miyuki Shirogane and Kaguya Shinomiya. The two are infatuated with each other, but since they're both convinced that falling in love is a sign of weakness, all they do is craft elaborate schemes and engage in convoluted mind games to establish intellectual dominance and force the other to confess their love first. At the beginning of the story, Kaguya-sama thereby presents itself as a deconstruction of romance stories. This is not a feel-good tale about two characters finding true love, but an exploration of the grim realities behind interpersonal relationships. In the worldview espoused by Miyuki and Kaguya, admitting their feelings for each other would not result in a happy ending like in an ordinary romance, but in a humiliating loss for one of them. So the majority of early chapters revolve around the two exploiting seemingly every minor interaction with each other to manipulate the other into confessing their love first. The main source of humor here is the contrast between the relatively mundane events, such as asking for each other's phone number or playing a card game or choosing seats at the cinema, and how these events are overanalyzed by two protagonists who raise the stakes up to 11 at every turn. The beginning of the story also has a remarkably simple setting. The story revolves around only three major characters: Miyuki, Kaguya, and the student council secretary, Chika Fujiwara. Chika serves as the foil to the two leads. She's a bubbly, happy-go-lucky girl who's completely oblivious to all the mind games that are taking place right under her nose. She serves as a comic relief and puts the two main characters' constant battles of wits into relief, but also complicates and thwarts their schemes at every turn. And this is by all means a great hook. The premise of Kaguya-sama is both easy to grasp and highly entertaining. And what's especially impressive is that the story only requires 8 pages of exposition before it dives straight into the first game of 3D chess between Miyuki and Kaguya. There are no elaborate backstories, the character concepts are easy to understand, all of which allows the series to showcase its main selling points right off the bat. So far, so good. But Kaguya is by far not the only rom-com with a strong start. And all I was wondering during the first few volumes was how long this premise could be milked out until it would inevitably become repetitive and boring. The earliest parts of Kaguya-sama give little indication that we should expect major plot or character development. And while there might be some who'd enjoy 250 chapters of mind games between these two protagonists, I knew that I would eventually lose interest if all this series did was rehash a single concept over and over again. But this is exactly where Kaguya-sama completely surpassed my wildest expectations. As the story progressed, it segued from standalone comedy chapters to more of a story manga that gets you genuinely invested in the development of its characters. This manga excels at gradually building up its major story developments, and there's never a moment where a shift in tone feels jarring. And especially upon reread, it becomes apparent just how intentionally everything in this story was set up. So to illustrate this, let me show how Kaguya-sama handles character introductions. As we saw, the initial trio was all that's really needed to pull off the original premise. We have the two leads scheming against each other, and a third character to introduce complications and to put their antics into relief. And exactly because the manga's premise is so simple and efficient, the addition of another character poses major risks. Because if you haphazardly introduce a major character here, it could easily upset the established dynamics and detract from the manga's original hook. Kaguya-sama is very aware of this pitfall, and as a result, it never shoves a new main character down our throats. Over the first 7 volumes, there are 3 new main characters who are gradually added to the mix. We have Kaguya's servant Hayasaka, and the student council's treasurer Ishigami, and auditor Miko Iino. In each case, the story first shows them in the background before they're given a central and active role later on. In the case of Ai, for example, she first appears as a literal background character in Chapter 3. Then, she reappears in Chapter 9, which reveals her name and seeds in an important facet of her character. She's not just Kaguya's servant, but also someone who understands Kaguya on a deeper level, as becomes apparent when she easily picks up her mistress's hints. And in Chapter 12, we then learn that Ai is close enough to Kaguya that she can inquire into Kaguya's personal affairs. But it's only in Chapter 19 that the details about Ai and Kaguya's relationship are explicitly filled in. The narrator here establishes that Ai has been Kaguya's servant for 10 years, and that she's one of the few people with whom Kaguya does not have to keep up appearances. In a way, all this, however, has already been shown before it was told. The manga has carefully built up this character before thrusting her into the limelight. And it's only from this point that Ai receives more focus in the story. Kaguya is constantly leaning on Ai. She vents and she asks her servant for advice. And once we reach Chapter 29 and 42, she's established enough to serve as their focal character in her own right. But Chapter 2 is also the first time that it's suggested that Ai might have needs of her own, and that in some ways she envies Kaguya. One of these needs is brought out in Chapter 75. Because of the Hayasaka family situation, Ai's mother had very little time for her daughter, And for that reason, Ai cherishes even the smallest interaction with her mom. This detail is fleshed out further in chapter 111, where Ai's mother attends the school's parent-teacher conference. And not just for her daughter Ai, but also as a stand-in parent for Kaguya. This scene then also looks back to a dialogue in chapter 94, where Kaguya remarks that she understood Ai because the two of them are like sisters. And now, in chapter 111, the two are even literally sharing the same mother. This is the type of writing at which Kaguya-sama excels. Every moment of characterization organically builds on the foundations that had already been laid far in advance. Every detail is in some way anticipated, so that nothing feels sudden or forced. Yu Ishigami and Miko Iino are integrated into the student council in a similarly gradual way. After their initial introduction, they are the subject of running gags that allow them to make brief appearances and then leave the stage. So Yu either gets shot down and flees home, or he's somehow stopped from even entering the student council's room in the first place. Miko, meanwhile, keeps arriving at inopportune moments. She then misunderstands something and runs away in shock. And so while these gags are funny by themselves, they also serve to ease the new characters into the story, to get us used to their presence before they start occupying a more central role. The manga similarly sets up all its major plot developments in that way. So let's have a look at the first longer storyline as an example. This plot concludes with the student council watching a firework display together in chapter 45. And now let's trace all the groundwork that has been laid for this one event. First of all, chapters 5 and 9 both establish one of Kaguya's most important desires, a longing for ordinary experiences. The reason for this is that Kaguya, as the daughter of the head of one of Japan's largest business conglomerates, has had a sheltered upbringing, and at many times she envies the normal life of the people around her. Meanwhile, in chapter 7, Chika suggests going on a trip together during the summer. This idea is ultimately shelved, but nevertheless, the chapter insinuates that a major event might take place during this time. So we then move forward to chapter 26, which drops a brief, innocuous line that once more brings to mind the possibility of summer plans. Miyuki here suggests getting a job together with a friend during the summer. But when Kaguya hears this, she's dismayed, because as it turns out, she had been hoping to spend a lot of time during the summer with her crush. But then the most important pivotal foreshadowing takes place in chapter 36. Kaguya has here fallen ill, and Miyuki pays her a visit at home. To his surprise, Kaguya is in a complete daze. Ai's explanation for her mistress's odd behavior is one through Freudian psychoanalysis. In Kaguya's current state, her rational thoughts are no longer keeping her desires in check. And so in other words, at this moment, Kaguya is uttering her unfiltered thoughts and wishes. And remarkably, Kaguya keeps asking both Ai and Miyuki for fireworks. So for some reason, Kaguya seems to have a repressed longing to see fireworks, but at this moment in time, it's not entirely clear why. And for first-time readers, it might not even be apparent that there's any significance in these words at all. But 4 chapters later, summer break officially starts, and the student council members return to the idea from chapter 7 of getting together during the summer. Miyuki suggests going to a festival, and Chika is immediately excited by the thoughts of food, of games, and of fireworks. And Kaguya responds specifically to the reference to these fireworks here. So for a second time, it's hinted at that Kaguya has a strange fixation with vibrant pyrotechnics. Then, During the next 2 chapters, both Miyuki and Kaguya experience an excruciatingly boring summer. Because, since neither of them would even consider getting in touch with their crush, they end up doing nothing at all for weeks on end. But at one point, Ai mentions that she's following Miyuki on Twitter. And once Kaguya hears this, her reaction, of course, is to make an account as well. So we've got all these disparate plot threads here, which might not seem connected in any way, but then they all come together in the emotional roller coaster that is chapter 44. At the beginning of this chapter, it's revealed why Kaguya has been obsessed with fireworks all this time. As it turns out, she's never been allowed to visit a fireworks festival and has only seen them from afar, alone in her room. So when the day of the festival arrives, the event that had been anticipated since chapter 7, Kaguya could not be more excited. Not only will she meet her friends for the first time since the summer break began, but she'll also finally see those long-awaited fireworks from up close. Until she's hammered down by a hard dose of reality. Her family forbids her from attending the events. The idea that Kaguya's family severely restricts her freedom was of course already planted at the earliest parts of the story, but only now do we see what an emotional toll this has really taken on Kaguya's well-being. Despite her personal growth, she is still trapped in her family's clutches. But at the beginning of the chapter, one further plot point comes full circle. In her despair, Kaguya sends out her first single tweet from the account that had been created 2 chapters ago, about wanting to see fireworks. And as it turns out, Miyuki has been watching her account all this time, and now he leaps into action. And in the end, Kaguya manages to escape from her mansion and finally join her friends to see the fireworks. Now, I know that these story beats are not the most original ones, that you might know other manga which do something very similar. But what separates Kaguya-sama from other rom-coms is the way it can give the impression that everything suddenly comes together. Chapters 5 and 7 and 9 and 26 and 36 at first glance don't seem to be more than excellent comedy chapters. Yet, at the end of chapter 44, it becomes apparent just how much groundwork had been laid to reach this one moment. And Kaguya-sama constantly manages to tie together multiple plot threads and moments of characterization during all of its major storylines. The Firework Festival arc is even probably the simplest instance of this in the series. So all this partially explains how Kaguya-sama managed to keep my interest over 280 chapters. The series is brilliant at organically expanding on its original premise, at introducing characters, and at building up overarching storylines. But still, no matter how gradually and expertly such a shift is handled, many manga are not able to retain thematic consistency when they make sweeping changes to their tone and focus. Personally, I'm a sucker for stories that have strong overarching ideas and thematic messaging. Stories where single chapters or story arcs are not just good by themselves, but make the whole feel like more than the sum of their parts. And this is another area where Kaguya-sama completely surpassed my wildest expectations. This is a manga that really has something to say, and that takes its time to build up these ideas. So let's return to the series' original hook, that of it being an anti-rom-com of sorts. At the beginning of the series, it espouses an allegedly realistic worldview, that in actuality, every relationship is a power struggle where winners are distinguished from losers by their ability to deceive and manipulate others. Kaguya and Miyuki are never depicted as evil characters per se. Rather, since they're among the most extraordinarily gifted students in their school, they are suggested to have more insight into the fundamental nature of interpersonal dynamics than most of their peers. But still, this worldview is complicated by the emotional and physical toll that all their schemes place on Miyuki and Kaguya. Already from the earliest chapters, the manga examines the validity of this love is war mentality. So for instance, at one point, Kaguya tries to manipulate Miyuki into asking her for a ride home during a storm. Her attempt ultimately fails, and what's more, she falls ill while she's waiting for him in the rain. This leads to the chapter I touched on earlier, the one where Miyuki pays her a visit at home. In her delirium, Kaguya drags Miyuki into her bed, where the two promptly fall asleep. But when she wakes up again, she's abhorred to find Miyuki lying next to her and chases him out. And even though they soon talk it out, it takes a while for the air to clear between the two of them. This event is actually even the first real fight between Kaguya and Miyuki. Unlike with their usual shenanigans, there are still unresolved tensions lingering. The underlying issue here, as it turns out, is that Kaguya is torn in her response to the events. She's on one hand mad at Miyuki for taking advantage of the situation she was in, but at the same time, she's also kind of worried about the possibility that he might not have even been interested in laying hands on her in the first place. In essence, this storyline validates the series' underlying philosophy as it was established at the beginning of the story. Kaguya is here placed in a situation where it would not be socially acceptable for her to be truthful about her feelings, where expressing her true desires would indeed result in serious loss. At times like this, all she can resort to are white lies. And it's here that we get one of the most interesting juxtapositions in the series. Miyuki goes and addresses these tensions once more, and then the story's external narrator comments that an apology requires complete and total honesty, that obfuscating the truth will only breed ongoing resentments. What the narrator expresses here is the socially acceptable view of an apology, but Miyuki actually does the complete opposite. He seems to have grasped the cause of Kaguya's discontent, but of course he cannot bring this up directly. So instead, he appeases her with a lie. He claims that he actually did just very briefly touch her on her lips, and with this fabrication, the two can finally make up. We are shown here that the worldview with which the story began is ultimately justified. A conflict that was caused by one of Kaguya's schemes could only be patched up by piling on another lie. They're able to win because none of them acknowledges the truth at the heart of the matter. After all, the world of Kaguya is one where anyone who confesses their true feelings is the one who loses. But such a humiliating defeat is not only the lot of someone who confesses their love. Here's another shocking revelation. You might not be subscribed to this channel and thereby miss out on all my future content. After all, there's no escaping the truth. The last to subscribe is the true loser. As the story continues, much of the progress in Kaguya and Miyuki's relationship is predicated on further schemes and lies. There's one point where the two offer feedback on the design of a poster, but they hold diametrically opposed views. Ostensibly, they're disagreeing about whether the poster's border should have pictures of cats or dogs. But in actuality, their quarrel is nothing more than an opportunity to secretly express what they like about each other. Which is kind of cute if you think about it, isn't it? Yeah, so there's also an instance where the two get locked up together in a shed. And the joke here is that both of them are assuming that the other one has set this up. This leads them to make advances which they consider to be nothing more than playing along with the supposed scheme, even to the point where they almost share their first kiss here. Miyuki and Kaguya are seemingly making the greatest progress in their relationship up to this point by adding a misunderstanding to their intricate web of lies. But it's only in the manga's most climactic moment that it becomes apparent that intrigue and scheming is not just an initial hook, but the central theme of the entire story. Because during the end of the cultural festival, Miyuki finally expresses his feelings to Kaguya. Despite the character's growth over the past 100 chapters, the story in a way goes full circle. Miyuki here is pulling off the grandest, most elaborate plot in the entire series. And in keeping with the story's painstaking attention to detail, this is, of course, a plot where every element has been set up and teased over the course of 25 chapters. Miyuki here does everything in his power to ensure that the other student council members would be occupied so that nobody would get in the way of his time with Kaguya. He assigns Yu and Miko to the cultural festival committee, and he devises an entire fake mystery to keep Chika busy. He manipulates Miko into arranging a bonfire. He steals all the heart-shaped balloons on campus. And all this leads to perhaps the most stunning spread in the entire series, where Miyuki scatters all of the heart-shaped balloons down towards the bonfire to finally show his feelings. And in line with the idea that this is the culmination of what the manga has been about all this time, it's also striking that Miyuki's spectacle is actually not a proper confession if you think about it. Instead, what he's doing is sticking to his modus operandi up to this point. He's trying to be the one to make Kaguya confess first. Where Kaguya figures out Miyuki's whereabouts and approaches him on the top of the school's clock tower, he turns the tables on her and asks her to choose a prize for figuring out his plan. This is actually the exact same kind of maneuver as the one he used in the very first chapter during his confrontation with Kaguya. And even when he reveals the balloons, he does not explicitly express his feelings for Kaguya. In the end, even the moment where he seemingly confesses his love is a strategy to make Kaguya make the first move. From this perspective, at the end of the cultural festival, Miyuki has finally secured an overwhelming victory. He is finally the one to manipulate Kaguya into kissing him. So paradoxically, this moment illustrates both how much the two have grown and how nothing has really changed since the beginning of the story. And just as a quick warning here, I'm going to be touching on some events from the first 15 chapters after the ending of the anime from this point. So if you're an anime only and don't want to get spoiled, you might just want to click away now. So here's the thing. After the dust has settled, it turns out that Miyuki has not accomplished what he set out to do. Because even though he had resolved to confess to Kaguya at the cultural festival, in the end, he resorted to manipulation once more, rather than honestly expressing his feelings. And this backfired tremendously. In most every other romance story, a perfect Hollywood ending, like the one that Miyuki had orchestrated, would have been the moment where the couple gets together and everyone lives happily ever after. But Kaguya-sama is not a typical romance. It's a story about a relationship that had been built up of lies and deceit, where words and actions always have an ulterior motive. And as it turns out, the end of the cultural festival is itself a red herring. Everything about this scene suggests that we are here witnessing the dramatic conclusion of the story. First of all, there was already a sense of finality going in, since both Miyuki and Kaguya had finally acknowledged their feelings and resolved to confess their love once and for all. The stunning visuals of the balloon scene also seem like the undisputed payoff to the longest storyline in the series thus far. So with this moment, Miyuki has not only managed to outwit Kaguya, but also us, the readers. The events of the cultural festival are almost exclusively told from Kaguya's perspective, and we only occasionally get glimpses into Miyuki's thoughts and actions. But once his plot has been revealed, we can see how everything to this point was a trail of breadcrumbs that he had left behind. He had orchestrated all the story events so that we did not pick up on what was going on right under our noses. Within the following chapters, it becomes apparent that we were deceived in another way as well. The moment which, by all means, appears to be the finale is not where the story actually ends. While Miyuki and Kaguya stated that their actions reflect how they feel for each other, this also leaves room for ambiguity. As it turns out, Miyuki has deceived not only us and Kaguya, but most of all, himself. In the aftermath of the balloon scene, Miyuki is left agonizing about the meaning of their kiss and what the implications are for their relationship going forwards. In fact, this risk is even explicitly addressed earlier in the storyline. When Kaguya is discussing her confession strategy with Ai criticizes Kaguya's first attempt because it's open for interpretation. She notes that Kaguya might not get through to Miyuki if her confession contains any potential for ambiguity, and even makes a meta joke about misunderstandings being a trick to drag out stories. And this is exactly what ends up happening to Miyuki when he makes that very mistake. After the cultural festival, Kaguya reverts to her former standoffish personality as she sorts out her inner turmoil. In this state, she forces Miyuki to show his hand by asking him to define their relationship. And when he proclaims that he believes that they're a couple, she shoots him down without hesitation. She claims that a kiss like that is no big deal. And to add insult to injury, when Miyuki fails to see through her front, she finally utters the one phrase that Miyuki has feared throughout the series. So despite all the efforts that Miyuki poured into his spectacular display, he attempted to confess while still holding on to the love is war mindset. And since in this worldview, the person who confesses their love first is the loser, it should not come as a surprise that Miyuki was completely and utterly rejected as a result. In the end, it becomes apparent that their initial mindset could only get them so far, that they could never attain what they actually want as long as they hold on to the belief that love is a power struggle with winners and losers. And so, the failure of Miyuki's initial confession is not the end of Kaguya's and Miyuki's overarching character arcs. The story of them realizing that their worldview was flawed and overcoming what held them back to this point. Over the course of the manga, its initial philosophy is gradually challenged, both by what we learn about our protagonists and by what the characters learn themselves. So let me go to some earlier moments in the story, after which I'll return to the balloon scene one more time. Starting at chapter 59, this is a moment that marks an important transition in the story. It's where the cast's first year in the student council comes to a close. But after the end of their term, Kaguya eventually convinces Miyuki to stand for election one more time. During his re-election campaign, Miyuki is faced with one significant competitor, Miko Iino. During Miko's introduction, her philosophy is fundamentally opposed to that of the student council. Miko is the first character in the series who completely rejects scheming and manipulation. She's characterized through her uncompromising idealism and integrity, and her rigid sense of justice. The manga even goes out of its way to juxtapose Miko's high-flown ideals with the cynical pragmatism that had been propagated by the series thus far. Miyuki and Yu make light of Miko's efforts because they're convinced that they have this election in the bag, even without a proper platform and a campaign. Kaguya, meanwhile, tries to manipulate Miko into dropping out of the election by targeting her insecurities. And even Chika, seemingly the most optimistic, bubbly member of the group, acknowledges that their campaign promises are utterly hollow. All this frames the student council election as a battle of ideologies. Going in, we're led to believe that the election's results will also validate one of these opposed worldviews. But instead, the story goes in a different direction. When Miko is about to make her speech, facing the entire student body, she is paralyzed by anxiety. As it turns out, Miko has a history of loss and failure, from which she's developed severe stage fright. The former student council does not even have to lift a single finger to win this election. All they have to do is stand back and watch their opponent implode. In other words, if they truly believe that the end justifies the means, they would just have to sit back until they're handed an overwhelming victory and their worldview is affirmed once more. But this is not what Miyuki Shirogane ends up doing. Instead, he steps up, he restores Miko's confidence and engages in a debate with her. Miyuki still wins the election in the end, but Miko is allowed to give him a run for his money. And afterwards, he invites her to join the student council as its fifth member. As I noted earlier, this is not the kind of manga where you can introduce additional main characters haphazardly. Miko's recruitment into the student council is a meaningful decision, a choice that reflects Miyuki's true character. It demarcates that he does not believe in winning at all costs, that his moral code is not as clear-cut as it seemed to be at the beginning of the series. And so, as the student council enters its second term, it has gained an uncompromising idealist as its moral compass. We also see a changing attitude towards lies in Yu Ishigami's character arc. For this, we first need to go back to chapter 30, one of the chapters that most strongly consolidates the idea that human interactions are filled with lies and deceits. To set the stage, the school is currently in its exam season, and the two main characters are locked in a desperate struggle to attain the highest test scores. They stop at nothing to eke out even the slightest advantage over each other. These high-pressure circumstances bring out the most ruthless side of the student council members. When Miyuki, Kaguya, and even Yu make claims about their studying plans, all of these are revealed to be complete and utter lies as soon as the page is turned. And Chika, the most gullible member of the student council, falls for their bluffs, and her scores suffer as a result. The exams are presented as a survival of the fittest, where deceivers come out on top and the deceived are squashed without mercy. But 75 chapters later, when a new exam period arrives, we see a different story. Once again, every student council member seems to be lying through their teeth in the days leading up to the exams. Everyone except Yu. Yu claims that he has properly studied, the very lie that he told in chapter 30. But this time, the page flip reveals that he alone has told the truth. So what sparked this change and led him to finally start taking his studies seriously? Throughout the series, Yu's major struggle is his lack of self-confidence. In truth, Yu never tried to do well at school because nobody ever expected anything from him. All this time, he has been lying to avoid standing out, so that others don't pick up on his insecurities. But lately, he has been tutored by Kaguya, and now for the first time, he has found a reason to prove himself in not wanting to let her down. So when Yu resolved to confront his insecurities and grow as a person, he is the first to step away from the lies behind which he has been hiding all this time. But despite his best efforts, his scores sadly just don't increase by as much as he would have liked. And faced with this disappointment, Yu's instinct is to once more run away and lie. He tells Kaguya that he's content with the result and heads off. But this time, Kaguya does not allow him to get away. She drags the truth out of him and motivates him to keep trying instead of giving up after this one failure. At this moment, what we're shown by the manga is that deception is not per se a fundamental aspect of human nature. It's a kind of coping mechanism for those who cannot confront their own insecurities. This is the true thematic message of Kaguya-sama. This message becomes apparent from Yu's arc, but is most powerfully demonstrated in the finale of the cultural festival. A scene that shatters even the last illusion that love is war. When Miyuki and Kaguya come face to face on top of the clock tower, the manga reiterates its original premise, that the first one to confess loses. And after all its build-up, Kaguya-sama finally pulls back the curtain and reveals that this very premise was the biggest lie of the entire series. All this time, we have not been following two masterminds who have grasped the grim realities of human nature, but just two insecure teenagers who don't know how to deal with their first crush. This is the moment where we finally learn the true reason why they have been doing everything to force the other to confess their feelings first. Kaguya is afraid that her love is one-sided, that the kindness that Miyuki shows her does not mean anything special, and that if she got rejected, it would destroy their current relationship. And Miyuki fears that the difference in their socio-economic backgrounds would mean that he could never be on equal footing with Kaguya if he were the one to ask her out. And even though they had both committed to confessing here and now, they can't bring themselves to do so once the time actually comes. Even at the best possible opportunity, they both desperately wait for the other to confess first. The unresolved tensions from the cultural festival eventually boil over, and as we saw, lead Kaguya to reject Miyuki. And soon afterwards, Miyuki collapses from emotional exhaustion as the result of his most deep-rooted insecurity, his fear of failure. This is something that we've seen throughout the story, both in more serious moments and as jokes. For instance, it's a recurring gag that Miyuki fails horribly at many of the most basic activities, and then compensates with extensive practice behind the scenes. often with the help of Chika. But during the preparations for the cultural festival, he finally seems to have become more comfortable with his flaws. Here, he's once again confronted with one of his many shortcomings. This time, he's unable to create simple balloon arts. But now, he ends up practicing and failing over and over in front of Kaguya. In a symbolic moment, Miyuki popping balloons in front of his crush is not only foreshadowing for his grand scheme, but also represents his first attempt to burst the bubble that he had built up to this point and show some of his true self. But just when he seemed to have become slightly more comfortable with this side of him, Kaguya's rejection leads him to double down on the belief that he will only be loved as long as he maintains the illusion that he excels at everything. But Kaguya realizes once Miyuki collapses that they can't go on in this way. After all, it's not just the perfect Miyuki that she loves, not just Miyuki for his achievements. And in fact, all Miyuki's efforts seem to have had the opposite effect. The spectacular, intrinsically planned balloon show in a way made Kaguya feel lonely. After all, at its heart, this display was just another lie. Miyuki's attempt to enamor Kaguya with his carefully fabricated persona. And eventually, Kaguya confronts Miyuki. She proclaims that she no longer wants to hide anything from him, and confesses her love in the process. She acknowledges that there is something paradoxical about her wishes. After all, the only reason they were able to grow closer was by lying and hiding their true selves. But nevertheless, it now becomes apparent that they can only get so far in this way. The final hurdle could not be cleared with the love is war mentality. In the end, they get together not through a spectacular theatrical stunt, but by opening up, revealing their insecurities, and leaving the lies behind.